Oh, right. So, just check and see it's no, it's not. So, sorry about that false start. Welcome, everyone. I hope YULIYA's microphone is working to tonight's lecture, which comes from our fellowship program, Ukrainian European Dialogue, and will be held by YURCHENKO, who is currently an IWM fellow, but otherwise a senior lecturer in political economy at the University of Greenwich in southeast London. YULIYA is going to be talking to us for about 35 minutes or so on the subject, Who Needs the State? Freedom, Justice, Sovereignty, and Post-Wartime Ukraine, in which she's going to address several seminal issues about Ukraine's economic and political history since 1990, 1991, as well as looking forward into what happens after the present war is over. YULIYA, we're looking forward to hearing from you. After that, we're going to have a discussion, questions from me and questions from the audience. So if you'd like to take the stage.
Thank you so much, Misha. Thank you everyone for coming. Can you hear me okay? All good with the microphone? It's always a painful task to talk about Ukraine these days, but this conversation must be had so that the future is less painful than the present. And I'm honored to be here in the presence of a lot of people whose work I respect and admire, and to have Misha as my discussant, whose work on the connections between politicians and criminals and oligarchs has really helped me to bring some connections together when I was writing my PhD many moons ago. So it's maybe serendipitous, maybe not, whatever you will, but it is special to have this conversation here. I will be drawing in this conversation on the current geopolitical, economic situation in the world, where we're heading, on the work I've been doing in political economy of Ukraine and political economy of state, society, capital nexuses as a better way to look at nation states other than just nation states or states. And of course, at the current situation in Ukraine, the rebuilding or recovery planning that is on the table, whether it's going to be fitting to meet, whether the means on the table are fitting to meet meet the aims. I also want to draw attention to the book I published a few years back called Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketization to Armed Conflict, that came out in 2018, where I document how Ukraine's uneven integration into global political economy has bred the regime of neoliberal marketization, and through various power shifts and emergence of oligarchy and various geopolitical tensions has created conditions that made armed conflict in its various expressions possible. The second cover you see is a volume edited by Laszlo Andor from the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, and Uwe Optenhögel also from there, that was published last summer. At my university we've held I've hosted an event on alternatives to Ukraine's post-war rebuilding, and this volume encapsulates a number of articles, including one by me, on the state of things, the good and the bad in the planet and how to fix it. I'm currently working on the continuation of that project, so if you're interested in policy proposals, please do follow. But today I want to come back to this specific topic, because when we look at and this is what I'm working on here at the Institute, when we think about what is happening in Ukraine and why it's happening and what to do to prevent similar wars from happening, how to rebuild Ukraine, should it hopefully soon be free, we need to be asking ourselves a lot of really fundamental questions as to how these wars are possible at all, what constitutes freedom in contemporary societies, what is the meaning of sovereignty and why sovereignty of some is less important than the other, how to do economics at war and post-war. Indeed, what is happening in Ukraine now is exemplary, because here we look at the state where neoliberal marketization is being used in wartime, which is not something that is customarily practiced in previous history. Debts are priority over grants. Ukraine is still expected to service its debts, even though it is in a state of a genocidal invasion. And if that is not a reason to rush aid and suspend debt payments, what is? We are looking at the age of catastrophe, we're ushering into the age of catastrophes, including ecological catastrophes, and we must not blink at this dangerous junction. If this becomes a normal response to societies at peril, the world's dispossessed are lost. By February 24, 2 years into the full-out war, the war damage in Ukraine accounted to $155 billion at replacement cost. The full cost, of course, is significantly higher. As the war is ongoing, at this point, roughly 18 to 20% of Ukraine is occupied. Of course, it is hard to assess the full-scale damage that has been sustained, and that will only be known when the war is over. What is certain is that reconstruction challenges are enormous. Some estimates already at the beginning of the war, we're talking at something between 750 billion to $1 trillion. Again, we cannot know fully until the war is over. For the recovery effort and some of the plans that are on the table now, between 4.6 to 8.5 million additional labor force will be needed. They do not come from nowhere. So they are currently absent workers. Many of them are refugees, many of them need to be trained, many of them are now being crippled on the front line. And not all of them are planning to come back. So on top of that, according to the UN Humanitarian Agency, 14.6 million of people needed humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, which was a staggering 40% of population last year. And some 6.3 million have fled the country and remain refugees, mostly across Europe, which led the agency to ask for additional money to fit its needs. So just a couple of numbers to understand the scale and the scope of the problem, which is, of course, is enormous. We are living in the age where almost 80 years ago we thought with the fall of Nazi Germany that militarized fascism is over, but it is back on the international political scene. As multipolarity drive away from post-Second World War universalism intensifies, we shall ask ourselves, why is this happening and how many people, in fact, can exercise those universal human rights of individual and national self-determination? For the world's majority, they unfortunately didn't materialize beyond declarations. Wars and genocides keep happening because attackers get away without suffering the consequences, while victims suffer from systemic violence, odious deaths, exclusion from social security guarantees, and from climate catastrophes they did not produce, nor did they deserve. Militarized competition and productivist economic systems generate ecocidal effects and fast forward towards a future on an uninhabitable planet in a manner that is essentially imperialist and colonizing. While Western imperialism and militarized interventions enjoyed much-deserved scrutiny in scholarship, Russian geopolitics of self-victimization thrived in Western academia as Russia fetishism, glorifying and vilifying alike, thus clouding critical scrutiny and adequate positioning of its object in global politics and geopolitics. Post-91 regional hegemonic contestations and the current era of crisis created an environment where certain actors have moved to shape the future of the world order of reintegrating and disintegrating empire of capital. Conditions being imperfect, Putin tried to force 19th century-style multipolarity, where colonial invasions are rooted in the legacies of internal colonization of Eurasia. Russia's failure to modernize or keep regional geopolitical superiority after productive relations in the post-Soviet space started to break down has led to this move. Russian multipolarity is thus only counter-hegemonic, which some think it is, in a sense that it disrupts the liberal international order on which a global hegemony can be built. So through this prism of the Russo-Ukrainian war, Russia's authoritarian entrenchment in neo-colonial domestic and foreign policies, and the inevitability of the recent turn to what Timothy Snyder calls schizofascism, can be interpreted as a response to their failure to build a functioning capitalist state. In fact, one might wonder, how feasible is it to build such a state if countries with countless resources, such as Russia, fail? Or UK failed to regulate its polluting water companies, or United States failed to secure adequate healthcare access to a large proportion of its price-excluded population. So if the biggest economies around the world fail to build functioning capitalist state, why do we continue to pursue those modes of states? What conditions and preconditions are necessary to be in place for social order to be stable, democratic, and for economy to function without relying on authoritarian or even fascist repressions? Capitalist economic growth requires constant expansion into new markets, new space, accumulation and extraction of further resources, and production of waste on a finite planet to the point where the global science consensus is growingly and also growingly political states, that quantitative growth must end, yet the solutions on the table require more growth, require conflict minerals, and more ecosystemic threats. And we see that in the recovery planning for Ukraine as well. Here we shall account for the structure of global political economy, of course. We need to locate our economies under analysis in Ukrainian as well. We need to locate them in these global structures and assess the economies themselves in a broad sense of the word, going back to Greek oikos. So political economy here is returned to oikos, which is Greek, for which we derive the ecumenical, all in it together, economic, material providing, and ecological meanings, which talks about the interdependence of all creation, that combines what is conventionally thought of as economic, social, and ecological domains. This is what also Elena Ostrom called socio-ecological systems, with acknowledgement of finite nature of resources of humans and nature alike. So if we start taking that approach, that conventionally also could be interpreted as what is embedded in sustainable development goals and what is embedded in deep sustainability principles, we can start thinking about economic systems that can be sustainable and lead towards Vernadsky and others before and after him called noosphere, which is the sphere of reason, where humanity functions to preserve its own survival and survival of ecosystems around us. For that, neoclassical economic or neoliberal economic modeling is completely unfitting. Oikos needs to be seen as a socio-ecological system which is best governed by principles of polycentricity, as laid out in also Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning framework. And that is also something that is very, that relies on polycentric state and polycentric governance, and that is not uncommon for what Ukrainians call gromadas and for the historic modes of governance which relied on self-sufficiency and working in understanding with the limits and availability of resources around people. So here in my work, I also draw on Vernadsky and Drahomanov and other Ukrainian thinkers to show that devolved authority and self-governance approach and sustainable ways of living was and is rather customary to Ukraine's people, despite repeated historic attempts of its colonizers to destroy those practices via feudal, serfdom, and collectivized forms, collectivization from above systems. So productivism and extractivism, as well as environmental preservation approaches, existed under different regimes in Ukraine's borders, and require meticulous scrutiny, which I'm consolidating in future stages of this project. Coming back to the state. State is a very important institution. We are frequently told that it isn't, but it is. Social classes and modes of extraction of value from humans and nature are organized in present-day system transnationally. That means that they function through and in circumvention of the institution of the state, and that is so by design, through state-created extra-jurisdictional mechanisms of spaces such as offshore and special economic zones, where extraction of capital and surplus value can happen outside the purview of the state. Again, by design. The imperialist logic of poorly regulated capitalism pushes the limits of the possible in the everyday across time and space and makes intersectionally experienced inequalities manifest sharper each day across the globe and in Ukraine. This means that international solutions, and including solutions for Ukraine, that emerge need to be also international, and that will require modernization and democratization of international systems such as Bretton Woods, UN, and international labor organizations. In 10 years of war, Ukraine has changed drastically. As the economic situation has deteriorated and it was worsened by many previous crises, so had the state of the social contract that was enshrined in the country's constitution, but yet never quite fully experienced by population's majority, just like the human rights of people around the world. Erosion of social security combined with emboldening of capital at expense of labor and nature, and states' inability to serve as the Constitution's guarantor of rights and freedoms are what largely conditioned the revolution of dignity and necessitated the emergence of a thriving civil society. The latter, embodied in thousands of NGOs and individual volunteers, began to perform the function of both the state and market, and in provision of goods and services where they are needed, often free of charge, so to speak. That means that they were financed through donations of goods, money, skills, and time of individuals and their groups. And this concrete state failure is now being interpreted paradoxically by Ukrainian politicians as a reason to further dismantle the state, including its ability to oversee the functioning of capital, which is precisely what created the problems in the first place. Instead of shrinking the state, I argue what needs to happen in Ukraine, and not only, is that the purview and the remit of the state needs to be expanded, and not least to incorporate those who perform the function of the state on a steady financial basis to continue doing their important work so that their resources are used to serve the clients of their work instead of spending time on writing grants and reports and applications. That's a waste of resources. It's a very inefficient use of resources. And the state also needs to be re-envisaged and reconceptualized. That is a twofold task. So we need to think about the concept of the state as a nation state to be very limiting because of methodological nationalism, because states are not closed homogeneous boxes. State, society, capital complex is a much better suited concept. I'll explain in a minute what that means. The second task that needs to happen is that the state as a set of institutions that fits the recovery needs in Ukraine and elsewhere, that could deliver a resilient stabilization of social order, needs to also be re-envisaged, to be this polycentric thing. There have been a series of decentralization reforms in Ukraine, for example, that can help, can aid that task, but still kind of a lot of work still lies ahead. So here, this is where the polycentricity comes in. So I show in this project that polycentric state that fits polycentric system of governance is needed, which is polycentrically structured. It also regulates, ensures transparency, regulates finance, and enforces environmental regulations. Variegated local needs can be best met through variegated localized initiatives. This is where decentralization is actually quite useful. We also need a national coordination of initiatives and finance, and that is where centralized approach is needed via the state mechanisms with national reach. So the State Agency for Reconstruction and Development, for example, and multi-agency donor coordination platforms can pivot such efforts, but significantly more needs to be done. There is still, the main emphasis is on private investors and civil society, meaning strictly NGOs overwhelmingly, Trade unions are a bit of an afterthought. Spearheading development. And you've been watching news for the last 2 years. I do not know, maybe there are some investors here in the room, maybe there aren't. But I don't think you need to have 10 years of Wall Street experience to know that investing into a country that has no growth prospect and is daily shelled and can be occupied tomorrow is not a very good idea. So that money is not really forthcoming. It is only through the state that the rebuilding, especially during the wartime, that can happen. For that, certain rules need to be changed for Ukraine to facilitate for what is known in economic writing as fiscal activism, the expanded state with expanded remit. That means more public spending on public services, state being an investor and taking over key industries. There is talk in a lot of this post-war and in-war planning, and indeed the recovery planning that was presented in the first time in Lugano in 2022 in the summer. Then there was a follow-up conference I've already mentioned in London last summer. This June, in a couple of weeks, me and a number of other people, quite a few, will be in Berlin for a similar conference. The principles that were declared already have a lot of great aims: build gender equal, sustainable, smart economy. There are a lot of really great principles that are on the table, but they will not necessarily be achieved through private investment. We know that from the overwhelming amount of data on how private sector works, where it goes and where it doesn't work. I was also based in a research center for 5 years called Public Services International Research Unit that studies public services enterprises around the world. And in their some 30 years of work, they haven't found one enterprise that functioned better in private hands than it functioned under the public hands. It's always more expensive. You lose control and accountability and efficacy. And British water companies are a great example of that, and the railways and the rest of it. So it's not a good idea. Public goods and private goods operate according to different logic in the market, and the most hard-nosed conventional economist will tell you that. International, so these things need to be accounted for. But in Lugano already, there was unveiled an understanding, very realistic understanding, that there are certain tasks that can be carried out and should be carried out while the war lasts. Then there is short-term rebuilding of damage, and then long-term recovery of the economy. The initial plan held the liquidation phase allocated 2 years. We already passed that, obviously. Then short-term, long-term. So that kind of the understanding of the stage approach is there. And there was also an understanding that Ukrainians should have the ownership of recovery process. How it is very often understood in this documentation is that Ukrainians should be present at the table and have a say. I think that that definition doesn't go far enough. Ownership means actually owning something, not just putting a couple of words on a piece of paper. No, we're talking about property rights. This is what is extremely important. That is actually also been, in a lot of different initiatives, in the most mainstream documents pertaining to this recovery plan, there is a discussion about this ownership of recovery, that Ukrainians should be the main kind of target of all of these reforms. But I'm looking at it with a political economy eye, and I do not see it becoming. So Ukraine, amongst other things, is very heavily indebted, which is a significant compounding factor, and it's experiencing what's called alienation of the state. So this is where creditors determine the parameters of its macroeconomic policy. So a lot of the loans that Ukraine takes from IMF, for example, it is not allowed to spend on fiscal expansion. It is expected to shrink the state, meaning shrink the public spending, privatize, and the rest of it. We've seen how fantastically those things worked for the countries that got hilariously called pigs after the financial crisis. And we've seen how Troika handled themselves in those negotiations. If anybody is not familiar, pick up Yanis Varoufakis' book, Adults in the Room, where they simply at one point refused to negotiate with him being in the room while he was the finance minister of Greece at the time, because he actually knew how the economy worked, and he knew that what was on the table will destroy the economy. And that included privatization of ports and whatever else could have been generating revenue. So we cannot allow that to happen. In fact, the evidence of such of austerity approach being detrimental to economic growth is so overwhelming that one might ask, why do we continue pursuing it? And those who are still wondering, pick up, please, Clara Mattei's book on how austerity was designed to secure the interest of capital against labor and led to fascism already once before. Coming back to our Ukraine conversation. In Ukraine, of course, the problems with economics didn't emerge only with the invasion. They have existed before. Russia's invasion of Crimea, and with that existed class conflict. And I'm happy to talk about the history of it in the Q&A. I've studied that over the years, so have a few anecdotes. Russia's invasion of Crimea and the proxy war in Donbass allowed for the achievement of revolution of dignity to be hijacked. The regime largely survived, albeit with different figureheads. The vote in favor of Zelensky was Maidan voting booths. This is how I interpret it. Because there was already an invasion in the country, the social consensus was that we can't further destabilize the country internally. That's why there wasn't another massive uprising domestically. So people voted out establishment by choosing to vote for Zelensky. Indeed, sociological data corroborate that. But the underlying class conflict didn't disappear. Instead, it became more acute since the current invasion. And radical solutions which embody socioeconomic justice, and some redistributive logic will be required. Without that, there won't be stabilization of socioeconomic order or any order. Large-scale deployment of post-Keynesian policies can just about fit the task. Many in Ukraine have a negative attitude towards the state as an institution, and this gets instrumentalized by neoliberals in charge to shrink the state even further. The popular dislike of the state, though, is of the state as people know it, a corrupt, full of thieving cadre institution that doesn't really serve their needs. So we're not talking about people not wanting state provision, we're talking about rejection of specific type of system. And this needs to be understood. Once we look at sociological surveys, the popular demand is for a state similar to what a Nordic model is, fully deployed welfare state, for example. And for that, you can't have that without fiscal expansion. And with that, certain kind of debt holders' rules and what Ukraine is allowed to do should be changed. This fact is crucial to account for when designing the policy skeleton for future Ukraine. I'm watching the time, I'm going to take another 5. I'm trying to shrink things so that we have more time for conversation. It's always the best time. So there is a common misconception produced by neoliberal mythology that seeks to convince us in uselessness of states, in their clumsiness and poor performance, in their hindering nature as far as economic matters are concerned. In fact, capital relies heavily on the state in terms of property rights and investment protection, and in bailing out failing enterprises that they own and mismanaged. What capital doesn't like about the states is regulation and taxes, as those get in the way of profit-making supreme. It also doesn't mind states controlling labor force by, say, impeding protests and unionization, and by handing over common and public goods ownership to capital so they can charge labor for using those. Or dismantling labor codes they also don't mind, or ripping apart collective bargaining agreements. So states are actually playing a very important role, and it's already in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where he talks that the function of what was then known as civil magistrate was to protect private property owners from the poor mob outside. So but the state can be a different thing. It really can. We need institutions that provide us with goods and services and ensure that legislation is followed. And ensure that environment is not destroyed, and that the law and that there is a safety net for everyone. So for that, I'm just going to mention that I use Nikos Poulantzas and Gramsci and Machiavellian conceptualization of power in my work, which is where power is seen as centaur, that is partly consent, partly violence, and it's only hegemonic when it mainly relies on consent. Well, that consent is very shaky in Ukraine at the moment. And it's not just it's not only in Ukraine, and we're living really in very dangerous times. There were 4 foundational myths that legitimized this regime of what I called in my earlier work neoliberal kleptocracy in Ukraine, on which their kind of rule rests. That was the myth of transition. We must transition to market. No good reason why. The myth of democracy, that having a big number of different parties somehow, an election somehow translates into democratic rule. The myth of 2 Ukraines, that I think by now everybody is familiar with enough for me to stop on it for too long, and until recently the myth of the other that was ushered in since Russia invaded Ukraine, that there are some Ukrainians that belong, some that belong. We refuse anything that was in Soviet experience, and none of us participated, and that there are some enemies within that do not quite belong. What we see now is a forging of a different foundational myth. The current invasion has really unified Ukrainian population. We see a real manifestation of civic identity that unites Ukrainians, that not without issues, but they exist everywhere. But there is an embrace of the multi-ethnic and multilingual makeup of Ukraine, with processes of de-Russification and decolonization being underway, with mixed success and some misdirected zeal, but it's never quite a very smooth process. We are moving in the right direction. All national unity, though, in this existential war might not last if socioeconomic and transitional justice are not delivered to those who paid the ultimate price for the right to live free in their own land. Moreover, class conflict can turn rather violent, and that should also be avoided at all costs. That is possible to avoid, in my view, and to stabilize order. And to generate growth and achieve sustainability, should there be fiscal expansion that can lead to a multiplier effect, will potentially pay for itself, can animate exchange, increase productive output, and bring us, and also bring with it incalculable what is known in economics as positive externalities. That is positive side effects of economic activity, such as hope, social cohesion, thriving culture, regeneration of nature, faith in better future, and growing birth rates. There are some promising developments in this new Lugano framework, where by this year there is a talk about whole of society approach. It's not just private sector NGOs. There is realization that something else needs to happen, not least because there is realization that workforce will be a major problem, meaning lack of it, fundamentally. Whether it will translate into progressive policies being implemented that can give certain hope and trust to Ukrainians who are still inside the country and those who are abroad, it remains to be seen. But ahead lies, of course, first the reinstatement of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, for which reliable and timely and sufficient arms supplies are really key right now, as we can see that on the battlefront. Only this can secure regaining control over Ukraine's constitutional territory and its people currently captured by Russia. Enforcement of the constitution through reforms that would enable and deliver materialization of the rights and social guarantees for and by those who perform the function of the states and constituted all those who call Ukraine a home are the ultimate task and a bedrock of a fair social contract of rebuilding the country and building a situation that can take us to a lasting peace. Whether that will materialize is difficult to tell, and I'm hoping to discuss more of that with Misha and with you in the discussion, because the constraints I already mentioned are heavy indebtedness, and I'm happy to tell you more about what's going on with those negotiations. First, there is indebtedness. Secondly, Ukrainian state right now is functioning not as a guarantor of the rights and securities of Ukrainians, but as an auctioneer of Ukraine's resources and public goods that actually, under the constitution and the current law on privatization, shall be exempt from being sold. How prudent and how responsible it is to be auctioneering any assets, even if it isn't legal, during a war where you know you can't get a good price, is also a conversation that is worth having. The fact that Ukraine is being put in that situation, that no most well-meaning politicians will easily be able to overturn, is also a question for all of us to ponder. Why is the country at war being put in a position where they have to sell family, the silver is gone, probably, I don't know, socks by this point, while they can't even feed their own population? All public spending right now in Ukraine is funded by aid, and whatever is generated in the country through taxes is being sent to the front because the country is so broke. We need to safeguard Ukraine in the international system and the international system against imperialist tendencies of unbridled capitalism. Ukraine is also home to loads of natural resources, including rare earth minerals and metals that are now being all sold. And in the Ukrainian constitution, people of Ukraine are the owners of those resources, and nobody actually has a right to be selling them. That is something that is quite problematic. And the current party of the servants of some people has seriously liberalized the sale of natural resources and land. And that is also something that we need to be talking about, because Ukrainians might wake up not also having lost half of their country, but losing all of the rights that actually are guaranteed in their constitution. So we'll see where it will all leave us. These fundamental rights need to be guaranteed for Ukrainians, but also for the rest of the world's population, because real freedom and sovereignty is when you're free from hunger, from abuse, from violence, free to choose the career that you want to have, free to have health care when you need it, be free from homelessness and destitution, free to breathe fresh air and drink clean water, eat fresh and uncontaminated by chemicals and hormones food, and yes, be free politically to choose who actually does represent your interest, not whoever was sponsored by an oligarch. All those freedoms cannot exist apart. Thank you. My water.
Thank you very much, Yulia. There are several things emerging from that as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure many more amongst the audience. But first of all, I want to get one thing straight, because at one point in that you implied, you didn't state it explicitly, although you implied, and I just want to get clarification from you on this, that you were indicating that the neoliberalism which Ukraine was forced to import in the 1990s led to the war of 2020, 2022, and presumably 2014 as well. Can you just talk me through that, if I've understood you correctly, that neoliberalism does imply a descent, Ukraine's descent into war, and if so, how?
Thank you very much. That's a big question, and I'm glad that you asked, because it is a really important one. Of course, there is no straight line between neoliberal policies and warfare. Yet, in specific circumstances, when certain conflicting decisions and irresponsible policies are being put in place by some occasionally irresponsible politicians, conditions can be created where armed conflicts are more likely than not. That is one of the things that I show in my book. So, of course, when Ukraine became independent, it didn't really have any money in its coffers, no debt. That was sort of inherited by Russia. And, of course, they turned to IMF for loans. And with that, privatization came, and no, IMF didn't start the war. I'm not insinuating that, but through the 90s, in the process of capitalist class formation and working class formation in a new kind of dispossessed working class formation in Ukraine, these powerful ruling groups have formed that some people refer to as clans, some people refer to as blocs, who I mentioned, like, Yanukovych was the apogee of this kind of industrial capital from the East. And what they engage with, and this is what I appeal to in my work when I talk about this mythology that supported popular consent to this kind of further marketization of the economy, is that it became very pronounced in the orange-blue campaign, Yushchenko versus Yanukovych, where this kind of the myth of two Ukraines became this kind of political reality, because the political technologists, they call themselves that, who were trained in the States but worked in Russia and were from Russia very often. They were hired by Ukrainians to sort of help them game the elections and manufacture certain narratives. And again, I'm not insinuating that Russia manipulated the election. It's just, sort of like facts of where people came from and where they were trained. And so these sort of divisive political narratives are created where you only pay attention to certain electorate in certain constituencies who you know are more likely to vote for you, and you sort of forget about the rest. We see some of the examples of that in Britain, in the States, and all over the place. So this kind of these regional differences become regional divisions in the political discourse, right? That the East wants to be closer with the post-Soviet states and with Russia. There is industrial connections. We need Russian energy for big industry to be sustainable, for them to be buoyant, for people to have jobs, that sort of thing. And those people in the West, they, Banderovites, and they want to be in Europe, but they don't understand the hard-working people in Donbass. All of those things get sort of produced. So then these sort of divisions then, by the time Yanukovych refuses to sign the Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement with the EU, it gets exploited by Russia, saying, look, there is all of these people who don't want to be doing any of that. So it's just post-factum instrumentalization of certain tropes that were used in political campaigns by oligarchic groups who wanted to get control over the parliamentary and over the parliament and over the government. Right, so they engage in what I call the geopolitical preference in my book. Preference was the favorite card game of Kuchma. So you need your loans from IMF, and you need cheap gas from Russia, and you need this, and you need that. And so you engage in this kind of sometimes conflicting arrangements. And at some point, you need to make choices, which is what happened in late 2013 with Yanukovych needing to sign the Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement that Putin wasn't happy about. Does it mean that it's a good reason to invade? Does it mean that neoliberalism is guilty? No, it doesn't. It's a complex constellation of various events and steps that retroactively we can trace, saying that through this sequence, this is what happened. But of course, shouldn't there have been rivalry? And I place some responsibility on Ukrainian oligarchs for destabilizing the country and creating these divisions. Because should they have arrived at an all-national economic development consensus and sorted out the differences behind closed doors instead of pitching people against each other, they wouldn't have been, those people wouldn't have been shooting each other in the streets in 2014. And they couldn't have been as easily manipulated by Russia to become Russian proxies, for example, and scream Putin, bring troops. That wouldn't have been the case should there have not been this segment in Ukraine of politicians, oligarchs, sometimes it's the same people, who didn't think beyond their profit and created these cleavages.
Now, you said that currently, in anticipation of the end of the war, that the state is acting as an auctioneer of Ukrainian state assets, implying and then stating that this was an illegitimate thing for the Ukrainian state to be doing. Where and how is that auction taking place at the moment?
Okay, so there is the State Property Fund of Ukraine that lists some of those properties. There is this Invest in Ukraine initiative. There is Opportunity Ukraine that was Yanukovych. This is Advantage, that's it. Right. So Yanukovych had the idea, published a book called Opportunity Ukraine. Now we have a problem called Advantage Ukraine. So there is an online portal, there is an online portal where all of these resources, including lots of natural resources, that are actually under the constitution property of the people of Ukraine, are being listed for potential investors to choose and pick from. And of course, we there have a lot of metals and minerals that are crucial for the green transition and kind of green tech listed. There's been, there's been also it's kind of the atlas created. So what is it called? Yeah, the State Geology, Service. Geology and Subsoil of Ukraine service presented an investment atlas of subsoil management, which comprises over 140 fields to be set for electronic auctions in the near future. Then
so what you're saying, let me get this straight, Yulia, because what you're saying is quite dramatic here. You're saying that the Zelensky government at the moment is unconstitutionally auctioning off the future state assets of Ukraine during the war. Is that in order to fund the war, or is that in order to fund the reconstruction later on? Is this in your opinion illegitimate?
Fundamentally, if we're looking at it from the legal perspective, it's a bit of a mixed picture, right? So on the one hand, under Ukrainian constitution, Ukrainians are the owners of land, subsoil, maritime resources, the lot, right? And also the state's job is to secure that no business activity is violating environment. All of that beautiful stuff is already in the constitution. Also, that Ukrainians own all the land and what's in the land. The state, as the executioner, as the elected executioner of the will of the people, potentially, if it is in the interest of the people, can alienate some type of property if it is, again, in the interest of the people, if we're looking at it from the legal viewpoint. So technically, it is possible. Also, on the other hand, so because there is this kind of complementing legal issues here. On the other hand, these kind of the matters of, we know that with the matters of land, because there was this big debate about privatization of agricultural land. It was already established by the Constitutional Court and internationally that this is the kind of matter that requires an all-national referendum should land be alienated to foreigners. So by extension of that judgment, I hold that selling outright natural resources that under the Constitution, the property of the people, also requires an all-national referendum. Any change of any stipulations in Ukrainian Constitution have to be subject of all-national referendum. That's in there. So I think considering the complexity of the situation that Ukraine is in economically, considering that a lot of those resources Ukraine doesn't have the technology or the finance to actually exploit, it could be potentially prudent to either have some joint stock or purchase equipment. There can be things organized and with strict environmental regulations, perhaps stipulations on employment of domestic force. There could be ways of doing it without having any significant issues. However, it is not my understanding that that will hold. And in that sense, again, that means that the ownership of those resources is being too easily handed over for very little money to foreign investors. I'm not against foreign investment per se. Ukraine does need it. But if investors are regulated, if they are not violating environmental code, if they are not, if they're paying good wages, if there is decent working time being followed, that is, that is a normal economic practice in my view. It wouldn't be a problem. But the way that it is being done is not that.
Now, the picture you paint of Ukraine at the point when the war comes to an end, and I know that's quite a speculative position, but I want to imagine that we're coming to the end of the war. The picture you paint of the economic situation is absolutely devastating. And as you said, it is going to require vast resources in order to get the economy and get society back onto its feet. But at the point when the war comes to an end, not only will the economy be devastated, but there will be a massively reduced population. It will be a disoriented population, in many respects atomized. What is the motivation of, particularly of big Western corporations and of Western governments, when Ukraine is going to be on its knees and acting as a supplicant? What is the motivation of those neoliberal forces which have accommodated themselves perfectly happily to Ukraine up until 2014, 2022, to suddenly turn around and say, well, actually, yes, we will go for a more just Keynesian state-steered system in which local interests must take priority as you identify them. Can you conceive of a world where that is going to happen?
Well, one can dream. I'm not convinced I will live to see it, but there are a lot of things I don't think I will live to see. There is potentially a way to gain some cookies for labor versus capital in this situation. And the fact that the war is ongoing and no big investment is going to meaningfully happen anytime soon, and the fact that you actually can invest in green and purple jobs and through that generate tax and therefore decrease reliance on foreign aid, can be a convincing argument to politicians in charge of those countries who are sending aid to Ukraine. And this is the kind of political campaigning that I'm engaged in right now. And if you combine that kind of public spending of aid money with wage-led growth, however limited in the current situation, and you actually draw from the good bits of the Marshall Plan and previous post-war recoveries, where it was understood that you need to have some measures of economic protectionism, you need to have some sort of dirigist state that coordinates things, you need to allow for state-owned enterprises to exist. And we've seen similar things happen in Japan and North Korea, for example, where there was fear of spread of communism, so let them have big states. You know, where we have fear of spread of Russian fascism and encroachment, further encroachment in Russia, let Ukraine have publicly accountable state-run enterprises that are functioning on kind of collective ownership basis and actually meeting the needs of population. Also, if you invest in care and green jobs, they are low carbon from the start and they're needed all the time. So it's a win-win, and they will be needed in 20, 30, 40 years' time. You can actually potentially build an economy that can at some point get itself out of its economic hardship if you prioritize economic activity where there are needs, not where a couple of investors see potential for profit. A lot of these natural resources that I said foreign investors are interested in potentially also in the area where there is a lot of fighting right now, and some of those areas are currently occupied. We are not looking at anything serious happening there for a while, and I think this gives us time to engage in political campaigning about the parameters on which should those investors be let in, they are let in, so that Ukrainian population and economy are not simply extracted, but also get something back. I'm not naive. I do not expect that some drilling companies will simply hand over equipment and Ukraine will run its own companies and then compete with them. Most likely that won't happen, because it kind of doesn't. But there can be better conditions made. And I think here also the Ukraine's European membership aspirations, which also I do not think I will live to see, allow for, and the harmonization of regulations actually allow for some of the most advanced environmental protection and labor protection legislation to be adopted, so as to actually create some conditions to which Ukrainians might want to come back. If those conditions are not created, they won't. The fact that there is a significant shortage of labor actually gives labor the power. The fact that there is this whole of society approach is being integrated into the Berlin framework, and that ILO actually said initially there was thinking that there will be 4.6 million shortage of people to execute the plans that were on the table. Now ILO have calculated that to come back to economic growth at the base level scenario, you need extra, on top of now, you need 8.6 billion people and 5% year-on-year growth in engagement of female workforce into paid employment. For that you need kindergartens, for that you need canteens, for that you need reskilling, upskilling, education, you need public housing program. So this project that I'm doing now with the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, and I will be talking about it at the Berlin pre-conference. Actually, with specifically, I got a couple of experts on boards and been doing interviews with trade unions, and there are domains already established where what is needed to happen. But without fiscal expansion, it won't happen. We need social housing program. The current government approach is subsidized mortgages. 40% of the population relies on humanitarian aid. What mortgages? People can't pay their energy bills. And if you adjust it for purchasing power, Ukraine pays the highest price for energy of all European states. There is only so much market you can do when you have half of your clients are paupers. And that reality needs to kick in at some point. We already have seen a progressive shift in the Ukrainian government approach to the taxation. They changed the taxation policy and approach this year. They see that they understand that the aid will not be coming at the same rate that it was. Next year already they're looking at almost 10 billion. There will be almost 10 billion hole in the budget. That's with aid for public spending. So material reality is a very good corrector for economic policy, and the horrendous state of it might just as well create a situation for a slightly more progressive approach to develop.
Thank you. I'm going to throw it open to the audience now. So questions, comments, please. I leave it to you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, Mike, wait for the microphone if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you very much. That was indeed very interesting. And you showed an aspect of the presence and the past, presence and future of Ukraine, of which many, I think even in this room, were not aware. And I can only support you, and I think I would like to ask you what you think about it. There are initiatives in Ukraine itself to prevent or try to prevent the sale out of the Ukrainian resources. And one of the resources is also the nature. So I'm involved in a project, Free Sidovets. You have probably heard of it. It's in the Southern Carpaths, you know it also. And I think this is very important. How do you think can we support such initiative? It is about the sale out of a unique biodiversity area, forests, pristine forests for some skiing projects, and everybody thought because of the war this will be stopped and so it will be over, but that is not the case. And I can send to those who are interested, or you just look in the internet under Free Sidovets with Y and TS at the end. And yes, the nature also in view of the climate change is extremely important. And what could, in your view, to be done to prevent this destruction, which will have an enormous impact on the future of Ukraine? Thank you.
Do we collect a few or do we go on?
No, I think we go on.
Okay. Thank you so much for bringing this up. It's very important now to engage in every possible way in fighting against the destruction of Ukrainian nature. And for those who are not familiar, I want to mention that Ukraine is home to 35% of all European biodiversity, and a lot of it is actually where the fighting is happening now. And I also want to remind everyone here that almost a year ago, Russia blew up the water reservoir next to the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, in Zaporizhia, having destroyed a very unique ecosystem, pouring an insane amount of water into the Black Sea, fresh water into the sea, horrible damage to marine ecosystem and to the terranean ecosystems, and of course putting the nuclear power plant in jeopardy. The ammunitions that they're using in the and various metals and gases contamination from warfare is absolutely stupendous. And this is also the reminder that the sooner the war is over, the less of that destruction will be happening. Fundamentally, the ecocidal function, the ecocidal activities, if we are to think about them in Ukraine, they didn't start with the war. Of course, they got exacerbated, but they didn't start. And a lot of it has to do, again, with the accumulation of capital by some irresponsible and predatory people, who actually, it is unconstitutional that the state does not make sure that economic activity does not destroy nature. And it is not just the current government, it's various governments. And there are some politicians who came to power in 2019 who have been trying to change things, but the amount of those who want to get in their way is significantly larger than not. And the problem is, the problem with overlooking environmental regulations and corruption that covers violations of environmental codes is omnipresent from small level, village bureaucrat to the top state level. And therefore, again, this is a failure of the state to guarantee rights, environmental rights and protections that should be in the Constitution, right? So, chopping down of protected forests, building private villas in environmental protected zones, and closing riverbanks and getting private access to stretches of seashore, all of which is guaranteed by Constitution to be public property and is not allowed to be privatized. All of that stuff has been happening for years. And I think here again, and this is where I share my hope with people who were at Euromaidans in 2013. The reason that people were willing to have this kind of political rapprochement with the EU is because of the rule of law and the regulations. So there are a lot of actually really, the reason I keep talking about like coming back to Ukrainian constitution is to highlight that it's not that Ukraine doesn't have good laws, just they're not very often enforced. Right? So I say that we need new social contract and we need a different state, and then I start citing constitution, like, oh, it's actually all already there, we just actually need that enforced. Thank you very much. And the state and the Ukrainians' ownership of land and natural resources is also something that is quite unique to Ukrainian legislation compared to a lot of other states where enclosures happened much earlier than they are happening now in Ukraine. So, and there has been pressure from the European Central Bank, from European Commission, from IMF on Ukraine for a number of years to put agricultural land to privatization, to the point of suspending tranches of loans on which Ukraine depended so as to not default until those laws were passed, which are anti-constitutional. It is for lawyers to figure out the nuances of that, but you know, I do not have a judgment in my hands, but I can see anti-constitutional activity when I see it. Some of it is sort of gray zone, some of it is really outright wrong. So there are many initiatives around the country. There are fights against there are struggles against real estate developers who build in protected zones. There are struggles against building roads where they don't belong. There are struggles against industrial enterprises dumping waste into the rivers. That is happening. There are quite a few. They do not often get mainstream newspaper coverage, but when you go into local papers, you see them and you find them. So there is, Ukrainians are not a passive nation. They do fight, and there is quite a lot of resistance. And I think that after, especially in this war, there's been already so much taken from people. They're really not willing to put up. And it's a very unstable political situation. Poroshenko paid with his presidency for not understanding that in time. I really hope that people who will be up for the next election and those who are in power now can wake up to the reality that there is only so much you can take from people before they finish what they tried to do in 2014.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia, for your talk. You were mentioning before that you're reading now about historical self-sufficiency literature, like from Ukraine, and I was wondering if you can say a bit more about that, and how would you link that to the recovery plans you're mentioning and you're working with? Because you were talking like about polycentricity and governance, and is there a link that you make actually, and yeah, what is the Ukrainian heritage of that?
Thank you. Well, that's it's really it's good to see you, and it's good that you mentioned that. Well, self-sufficiency and sustainability have been quite widely practiced by Ukrainians, not least because for centuries Ukrainians were under rule of different empires, and a lot of whatever access they had was expropriated from them. So the understanding that you need to be really responsible with what and reuse and use till the end whatever resources you have is something that is sort of like ingrained and trained in the rural population from very like for hundreds of years. To the point, and then of course constant deficits of consumer goods in the USSR. But I'm not going to go into current trends in consumerism that are partly linked to that. We can leave that aside. But in terms of self-governance and kind of social dialogue and hromadas, that is something that that we see in the political thought of the late 19th, early 20th century. We see that quite a bit of it in the political thought of Drahomanov, for example, who understood that for Ukrainians to be able to have any kind of degree of economic autonomy, under the Russian Empire, for example. Certain degrees of federalization need to happen, and that small communities in countrysides actually were quite good at self-governing. They just needed a bit more autonomy, right? And then at that point, of course, full independence for Ukrainian state as such was not something that was possible for complicated historical reasons. But that whole kind of the understanding, I think, of what is possible within any specific regimes of governance in which you live is actually, can teach us quite a lot about the current situation as well. Ukraine is very economically weak at this point for very complicated reasons. Again, it needs foreign investors, and it needs foreign aid, and it needs foreign loans, and it needs legal oversight and help and technical assistance and all sorts of different things, right? More than even at peacetime. And in the rebuilding also, it will need that. That will mean that certain degree of political autonomy will, of course, not necessarily instantly materialize. And we need to be realistic about that. But there still is a degree of autonomy and self-governance and devolution of authority that one can exercise in such situations, while also having a compromise with those who will come to make a bit of money, but also effectively also perhaps help you. And in that kind of constellation of things, I think looking at what people who thought under different but equally trying circumstances can be quite informative. Yeah, and I look also to Vernadsky, I already mentioned, and a number of other people. I can talk with you later. And the noospheric vision of Vernadsky, I think, is extremely important. When we start to think about like building a deeply sustainable economy, because if we understand that all our research and development and economic activity and productive activities need to be geared towards having a thriving life and preserving our own species and ecosystems around us, and that should be the aim and the final goal of our activity, you start building very different economic systems rather than those who, because they don't want to get out, don't want to leave their individual car, are happy to mine for rare earth minerals just so they can drive a Tesla. It's a very different economic model from that. If we see where popular needs are, public housing, education, healthcare, arts so that you can feed your soul, preserving the nature and ecosystems so that we have somewhere to live and something to eat that doesn't kill us. If you engage in that, what Tim Jackson calls prosperity without growth, that is quantitative economic growth, you can build very different economic systems. It is possible. And in this kind of constellation where one can dream, right? In this kind of constellation where Ukraine finds itself, I think, of course it needs debt relief. I'm not sure whether that will be forthcoming. And so this is where I also get crafty. And I think, okay, there can be growth in other sectors that are not also destructive and that where jobs can be created now. And if also there is increase in wages, there is increase in taxes, and within the same fiscal cycle, that kind of public spending pays for itself, that sounds like a convincing argument to somebody who is sending money here as a government, because they're accountable to their electorate for the money that they send away as aid. So this is my creative solution in the current horrible circumstances. Thank you.
Petra.
Okay, thank you for the lecture and for your engaged approach. It's really inspiring. And I would like to ask you, I think that we can look at the war in Ukraine as a gendered problem, very gendered situation, and quite a conservative one, I would say, that so men are supposed to fight and women are with kids and so really often abroad. So I would like to know if you are working with kind of gender data and how you can interpret them in framework of post-war Ukraine or the renovation of the country.
Thank you very much indeed, and I've already. It is a heavily gendered problem, of course, because men are obligated to fight. Women are only obligated to fight if they're in the list of specific professions that are key to the military. If men are carers for children, they don't get conscribed. Right? So there is also a list of exemptions under which men don't get. If you have 3 kids or more, you're exempt from service. If you lose a member of the family, you also get sent back. It happened indeed to a relative of mine of 2 brothers. One got killed, the other one got sent home, so that the mother has 1 remaining son at least. I don't want to spend too much time going through all sorts of different examples, but there are different things that exist. If you have a child with a disability, you don't go to the front, neither man or woman does. So there is, it's not all men serve, all women don't. Ukrainian military also has one of the highest proportions of women in the armed forces who have volunteered to join. Right? There are, of course, problems with equipment and uniform and everything else. Like, it's quite problematic. There is sexism in the military, but compared to a lot of other militaries, it's not as bad from the data that I've read. In terms of recovery, this also I've mentioned that a lot of the labor, and what I write about in my work, a lot of labor force, female labor force, is in economic terms productively immobilized by care responsibilities. What I mean by that, like productive labor in economics is called labor for which you are paid, which of course is a very problematic framing, and Marilyn Warren already wrote about it in the 80s. Of course, women who look after children, should it be a man or a woman who look after children, progressive gendered politics towards child rearing or any care responsibilities should be that a person, no matter what gender they are, who decide to look after the child or a relative, should be compensated by the state. I'm for wages for housework and care work. I'm with that. I'm all second wave here. In terms of mobilizing women into paid employment, also to unchain them from the kitchen sink, which I'm all for, we need to have social reproduction infrastructure being fully funded. There's been serious defunding of kindergartens and shutting down of kindergartens, post-school activities. The social care is borderline non-existent, so if any of the elder relatives get unwell, it's like usually falls on some woman in the family to look after them as well. All of that stuff needs to be reintegrated back into the state. Some of it was provided under the USSR, some of it wasn't, but a lot of it got depleted since the 90s. And if you put people on paycheck and professionally train them to look after someone, they have that emotional distance. Then those who actually who looked after them have free time and mental space to do something else with it, but also engage in paid employment, pursue career, or maybe do something else. With their life. And with the need to reintegrate more women into workforce, that is, the state will have to do that. So we will see what comes of this. There is a lot of dynamic changes that are underway, but the gendered approach should be that there are meaningful choices should be created for men and for women. And adaptation of workforce to people with caring responsibilities, overwhelmingly women, need to happen. Women go through menopause, men don't. That kind of accommodation in the workplace needs to happen. Accommodation for nursing mothers at work need to happen. Have a creche at the workplace, for example, so women can bring a child, drop off, or if it's a man looking after a child, they can drop off. All of these adaptations that we know that there is plenty of that in sociological and economic research of these accommodations that need to happen. So like this gender progressive approach will need to also require fiscal expansion. What we now have very often is this kind of neoliberal thing, we need more women leaders, and that's it. If you're resilient, if you're strong, there you go, here is, like everybody should be like you. If you're poor and you're exhausted and you're burnt out, well, you're not resilient enough. And that thing needs to disappear. In this project that I lead now, we have a whole separate brief on impoverished mothers, many of who were displaced, and it's extremely tragic. It's extremely tragic stories. So to address their stories, what they need housing, they need kindergartens, they need psychological support, and also change in attitudes, change of culture in the society, that just because you are not resilient, meaning you probably have help from somewhere else, you somehow have failed. Weakness is not a sin.
And I think we've got time for one more question. So.
Phil Howe, Adrian College. It's sort of a big question, but...
Oh, can you wait for the mic? Sorry, just because it gets picked up by the...
Oh, got it. Phil Howe, Adrian College. So this is sort of a big last question. A lot of analyses of the invasion of Ukraine and the future of Ukraine put an emphasis on the role of the United States as a superpower. And, you know, it's kind of obvious it's playing a big, if sometimes superficial role in American domestic politics. I want to turn that around. In what ways, if any, do you think this year's American presidential election actually matters for Ukraine? And more importantly, in what ways do you think the outcome of that election is irrelevant to the future of Ukraine?
Thank you for the small question. It's a very important question, though, and I'm glad you asked it, because we hear a lot of this narrative that, oh, you know, we can't let Russia seriously lose at this war. What if Russia falls apart? What will happen? We need to also think what will happen if United States are not in charge of things all of a sudden. Because we can criticize this international order till we're all blue in the face. And we can talk about how it emerged, what it is from the ashes of the Second World War and everything else. But when US is, there are certain things that work in certain ways. And if US are in disarray, there are a lot more dangerous things happening than when Russia is in disarray, precisely because of the importance that they play in international politics. And we have already seen what was happening, how many people have unnecessarily died in Ukraine because armed supplies were delayed, because of domestic politics problems in the United States. And of course, you know, if Trump gets elected, there can be a lot of serious problems for Ukraine. And we see that in the narratives about Trump proofing the aid and this and that and the other. On the other hand, of course, Trump being who he is, and really liking to be the big guy and on top of things, it can also turn out in a way that he would increase arms supplies. I'm not inside his head, I don't want to be, so I can't tell you. It's bad enough I have to guess what Putin is doing. It's enough, believe me. So it can turn in a lot of different ways, but I think it's not just an issue for Ukraine, it's the issue for the international law-based order, which has not been very orderly for quite some time. And this is also why US permanent representatives can sit at the UN tables and look Americans in the eye and go, we're not doing anything you've not done before. I'm not trying to put any sort of equality signs between any specific wars. That is an ungrateful exercise, and I'm not here to do that. But we're talking specifically about violation of certain rules. And I think this is something also that internationally, this war and now what is also happening with Israel and Gaza and Palestine generally, needs to be the last time these things are happening. Because when those who are entrusted to ensure the execution of orders and rules that they export internationally start breaking those rules, there is no incentive for others to follow those rules. And that is very dangerous. Putin, and his own version of imperialism and multipolarity is much scarier than the United States going a bit rogue once in a while. And I'm with Zizek on this, that the only reason, the reason we can call United States hypocrites is because they are trying to spread international liberal order. Imagine if they didn't try to do that. It's important to be able to hold somebody accountable to certain sets of rules. If they from the outset say rules don't apply to me, I decide what they are tomorrow, it's a much scarier reality. And in that sense, we need to understand that it's not black and white and it's not good and bad. It's a gradient and it's a scale. And this is why I think how this war between Ukraine and Russia gets resolved will determine a lot what kind of nature of that international rule-based order will look like, whether we still have any at all. And we really need it more than ever right now. Because otherwise we're looking at the breakdown of dialogue, we're looking at complete breakdown of any climate action internationally, any sort of security dialogues, you name it, it's gone. It is that serious. And this is why I talk about the era of competitive fascistic blocs looking us in the eye. And I really don't want that to happen. Not to be a Cassandra here, but like I tend to kind of fear the worst and try to make sure it doesn't happen in any possible way.
Thank you, Yulia, and thank you for raising what I think is a very important issue, and that is the domestic economy and domestic political economy of Ukraine, and what it's going to mean for the future when it comes to reconstruction when the war finally comes to an end, because I think this is a critical issue that is often obscured by the great drama and the great tragedy of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But it's a subject that Ukrainians in particular need to fully engage with, but it's also important that those people in Europe and the United States who are going to be engaged with reconstruction also need to be fully cognizant of. And so this is a very important project you're involved in, and thank you very much for presenting it to us. Round of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Misha. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And yeah, any questions, please come up after. It was a pleasure and a privilege to have you here. Have a good evening.